Well, hello, doubters. Have you ever wondered what is truth? How do we know what is true? I think these are the questions that really plague us. I did a video a few weeks back where I talked about the three most important questions that we can ask and get answered on our deconstructing journey. And I am going to start with the question, what is truth? And to do that, I've invited my friend David Pallmann on to talk about that. Well, if you are in the process of looking at your Christian faith and wondering if you can hold on to your Christianity, you're in the right place. Here at the Dealing with Deconstruction YouTube channel, we do that often. We talk about the deep questions that plague us when it comes to our Christianity. From someone that was abused by the church and really started to question my Christian faith, I want to invite you on this journey with me. You can join our Dealing with Deconstruction Facebook group. The link for that is in the description. And today we're going to be answering this question, kind of giving a broad overview with my friend David Pallmann from the YouTube channel Faith Because of Reason. David is a student at the Trinity College of the Bible, and he is also a member of the Society of the Evangelical Armenians. And as I said before, he directs the YouTube channel ministry Faith Because of Reason. We are going to have an excellent conversation. We're going to talk about the different categories of truth. We're going to talk about how we know what is true. And we're hopefully just going to give you an introduction to some of these concepts and some of these categories. And then we'll continue to drill down on them in future videos. So I would invite you to subscribe to this channel if this is something that interests you. David, welcome to Dealing with Deconstruction.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me on, Tim.
Well, I have to say that I'm really excited about this conversation. I stumbled across your YouTube channel a few weeks back and kind of went through all of your videos and was like, man, I really wish that I could have a conversation with David about some of these things because it's an area of interest of mine. And so I really appreciate you joining me for this conversation.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be on.
Well, for the audience, I'll kind of set this up again. I did a video a few weeks back, and I'll put a link in the description to that video, where I suggested that if you're on your deconstruction journey, that you answer these three questions first. And the first question was, what is truth? The second question was, does God exist? And the third question was, did God raise Jesus from the dead? And so that very first question, what is truth? David's channel has really dove deep into that question. And so we're going to do that tonight. It's tonight, it's evening when we're recording this, but we're going to do that tonight. We're going to really dissect truth, and we're going to get into this thing called epistemology, how we know what is true. And like I said, David's videos are excellent in this area, and so I'm excited to kind of push it and prod him a little bit in this area, and hopefully he'll give us a way that we can think about truth and help us answer that first question. So David, let's kind of start with, what are the categories of truth that philosophers use? Maybe you could, give an example of each of those as you, kind of lay them out for us.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different theories of truth. The dominant one, the one that I hold, and I think the one that anyone who wants to be faithful to historic Christianity and to Scripture is going to have to hold, is going to be the correspondence theory of truth.
Okay.
The correspondence theory says that truth is that which corresponds to reality. So correspondence is basically like a match or maybe an accurate description. But the basic idea here is that you've got reality, which is made up of a bunch of different facts. And then we've got beliefs, which are like propositions, sentences, thoughts, things of that nature. And we say when you've got an accurate description, an accurate proposition, a proposition that is expressing something that matches or that corresponds to a fact in reality, then we would say that proposition is true. That is the view that I hold on truth, and I think that is the common sense view.
Yep.
Another one would be the coherence theory of truth. So they would define truth as whatever is consistent with itself. So you don't have contradictions or something like that. Then, any propositions or it's not normally not going to be a single proposition, but a whole bunch of propositions that are all internally consistent with themselves. They would say that's what's true. And you've also got like pragmatic views of truth, which would say, well, truth is just kind of whatever works. So if this works for me, that's true. And that can sometimes come in with some relativism. So if it works for me, it's true for me, but hey, maybe it doesn't work for you. So maybe it's not true for you. So that could work with some relativism, but not all pragmatists are going to be relativists either. So you've kind of got both there.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think those are three main categories. You've got some other specified ones and obviously a whole bunch of variety within each of those three camps, but those are the three main ones.
No, that's great. So before we get too far, I've already mentioned the video that I did, but from your perspective, why is kind of nailing down a theory of truth so important to the endeavor of just understanding reality, to deconstructing Christianity, to kind of finding out what's important? Why is this something that we need to wrestle with kind of up front at the beginning of our journey?
Right. I think it's because all of the beliefs that we hold, we ultimately have this desire that they would be true. And so as we're kind of going on and building more beliefs, maybe adding beliefs onto these other beliefs that we hold, it's really important that these beliefs are closely tethered to reality, because that's what we want. We want beliefs that are matching with reality. That's kind of, I think, one of the main reasons that people will abandon belief in God or belief in the Christian faith is because they think that, well, the things that the propositions that are held to be true by Christians, they don't match reality. And so that's a big reason why people are going to reject it. So if someone wants to be a Christian, and I would argue the only correct reason to be a Christian is because those beliefs do, in fact, match reality. And that's really just true with all of our beliefs, right? Every belief that we hold, it seems to only be worth holding if it is, in fact, matches with reality, right? What's the point of holding a belief that doesn't? And there seem to be serious consequences if we hold beliefs that don't. And this is, of course, true in pragmatic cases, such as I don't want to put my hand on the stove because it'll get burned. Well, if that's an important thing to know if that is true, because there's a serious consequence. And analogously, of course, with religious beliefs, there can be serious eternal consequences as well if our religious beliefs are incorrect or if they are correct. So for, a lot of reasons, it's important to have beliefs that are tethered to reality.
No, that's fantastic. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes, and you and I talked about this before we jumped on the show, but I kind of see this idea as one of the most important things that we can really figure out. And I think oftentimes our theory of truth kind of starts to inform all these other pieces, like you said. And I see, maybe three large groups. As you have people that are deconstructing will either kind of really grasp this and really get kind of what we're going to talk about for the rest of the show, and they'll maybe end up staying in line with Christianity. Maybe they might vary in a few beliefs here or there, or other people maybe on kind of more of a fideism type thing where they just kind of believe it for not reasons that are built on evidences, or not reasons that are built on anything that's supported. They don't have a theory of truth at all. They're just completely, and not in a bad way, but they just have no idea. They're ignorant in the sense that they just have no idea that those things are out there. It may be more on experience. I know that for me, much of my Christian journey, before I started to deconstruct and really look into these things, that's where I was. I was a musician. I still am a musician. And my Christianity was largely built on the experiences that I had at church and the experiences that I had with people. And I had no concept of what truth was or epistemology or any of those things. And then I think other times people will start to kind of be aware of some of these conversations, but then they might slide into atheism or agnosticism or some sort of materialism. And for those people that are kind of on this journey and they're looking at Christianity and saying, well, you have these supernatural beliefs that seem really odd from our experience. You have, kind of this ancient book that things seem to be kind of built on? Like, that seems strange to me. And so then they start to kind of go down this road of really starting to ask some of these questions, and sometimes they'll leave Christianity completely, or sometimes, they'll maybe go to another form of Christianity, one that's more experiential in that sense. And so I think that's one of the reasons that it's really important here. So one of the first questions that I said that we have to deal with is this idea of truth. And one of the big pushbacks that I get when I'm talking about this is that there are levels of truth, right? Like, you can only know a proposition at a certain level. You can't know it all the way down. How would you think about and talk to us about levels of truth in that sense?
Right. So I don't think it's really correct to talk about levels of truth because on a correspondence theory, either something matches reality or it does not. Now, there can be complicated, maybe not, maybe collections of propositions is a good way to think of this.
Yeah.
So you could have a whole bunch of statements that are like, to get maybe like the Bible, right? If we take the Bible, for example, you could say that like there are parts of it that are true, but maybe you would say there are other parts that are not, right? I'm not saying that is my position, but it might be okay to say in a case like that, then you might say it's more or less true, but the way you're determining that is by the number of propositions that are actually true and the ones that are actually false. So really, when you get down to it, to the individual proposition, it either is or it isn't. But yeah, if you've got a whole bunch, then maybe it makes sense to talk about levels of truth, by which we're just talking about like the percentage or something like that. It makes more sense, I think, to talk about levels of justification. So most of what we know, we're not going to be able to know with 100% certainty. Like the bulk of our beliefs are known with a level of probability. Sometimes we get a very high probability. Sometimes we get a very low probability. So there's going to be the objective standard. That's what truth is. That's the objective standard. And our justification is just how many reasons, how much reason do we have for thinking that that belief does in fact match reality. And so that's really when it starts making sense to talk about levels. And so I think some people sometimes confuse those. And so they'll talk about levels of truth. Oh, well, that's sort of true. But what they might actually mean there is levels of justification.
So I think we're going to get to epistemology and justification, because that's one of the really fun things that I like to talk about. But in my video, and I was having a conversation with one of our community members on our Dealing with Deconstruction Facebook group, and he was kind of pointing out that what I see as kind of a basic question for anyone that's going to deny truth is you just ask them, is that true? Right? That kind of, it undercuts their statement. If you say there's no such thing as absolute truth, then you just ask them, is that absolutely true? And they're kind of stuck in a sense. Either they have to say, yes, it's absolutely true, and therefore their statement is false because there is an absolute truth, or they say no, and then their statement is false because they just denied that there is not an absolute truth. But when we were talking about it, he said, well, that's not really the whole story, right? Because you can't know things in completeness. And so you talked about that justification there. So even that statement alone, right? How would you think about kind of addressing that statement? It's like, okay, well, if we have this statement, there's no such thing as absolute truth, or we can't know absolute truth, or we can't know things for certain, right? How would you then go about addressing some of those types of issues?
Yeah, so this is kind of an issue related to maybe postmodernism. So postmodernists might try to say that, it's often classified as the belief that there is no absolute truth or something like that. But I really think there are two forms of postmodernism. You've got a hard version and a soft version. The hard version is kind of the easy one to get rid of, because the hard version is going to say, oh yeah, there's absolutely no such thing as truth. Person who's making the claim, you can ask them, well, is that true? And yeah, then if they say yes, then they've got a problem. If they say no, they've got a problem. Soft relativism turns out to be much harder because it's a purely epistemic statement. So they're not actually saying there is no such thing as absolute truth. They're more or less questioning our ability to get at it. So what they're saying is that we don't have any valid way of saying that this statement is true and another one is not. So like, let's all just be tolerant and treat all beliefs equally, because it's not that there is no such thing as truth per se. It's just from our perspective, there's no way to get at it. That turns out to be a much harder sort of postmodernism to defeat, in my view.
Well, and you set us up for our transition perfect here. So let's kind of talk about that. We'll spend kind of the bulk of the rest of our time talking about epistemology, which epistemology is kind of the study of knowledge, or the study of the way that we know things. And that's what you're talking about. So someone might come back with you and say, sure, there may be absolute truth, and maybe we can know some of those things, like what you just said, or that there is an absolute truth, but we can't actually get to that truth. We don't have any way to really understand that. Maybe there's a few axioms, some things that we make some assumptions about, but really we can't get to the kind of root core, what is true, what actually is reality at all. So maybe you can start with, kind of giving us these broad categories of epistemology, and then we'll end up kind of diving in a little bit deeper here as we go.
Yeah, sure. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. So if you have an epistemology, then you've got a theory of knowledge. And so epistemology deals with all things related to knowledge. So kind of a natural place to begin is, well, what is knowledge? And the kind of traditional definition of that word would be justified true belief. And it's important to really think about each of those elements, right? Like, can I know something but not believe it? Doesn't make sense, right? I don't know something if I don't believe it. Can I know something but it's false? Well, no, it would have to be true. So, but I can't just have a true belief, right? I can't, like, maybe if I just pick a belief out of a hat, right? Like, let's say I just decide to believe that Biden is going to get reelected, right? Well, maybe that's true, but like, maybe I don't have any reason for thinking it's true, right? Or maybe I'll just maybe to even pick a sillier example. Let's say that I think my dog is going to get elected president of the United States in the next election, right? Let's say freak chance it happens that actually happens, that my dog gets elected president.
Right.
Did I have any reason for thinking it was true, though, or was it just a lucky chance? So it seems like I got to have some reason, something that differentiates these true beliefs. So it's not just enough for our beliefs to be true. There's got to be something that makes a difference there. And so that's why we had the justification condition. So it's when you have a belief that matches reality and you have some reason for thinking that it matches reality. Justified true belief. Now, that's a controversial definition. It wasn't controversial at one point, but there have been examples offered that where supposedly you can have justified true beliefs and still fail to have knowledge. And I won't get into all that, but that's a working definition, justified true belief.
Right. No, and I think that's the first definition that I was introduced to, and so I think that's a definition that I continue to use. Now, some of that is, kind of pushed back on, and really it gets into what you were mentioning earlier about the nature of justification. But before we get to talking about justification, tell me from your perspective what role certainty plays in knowledge. Do we have to say that we're certain of a belief, or we're certain of a proposition in order to claim that we have knowledge of it? Or would you say that there are things that we do have to say are certain for us to claim any knowledge at all?
So the majority position in epistemology right now is known as fallibilism. And fallibilism says you can be wrong about every belief that you hold. So you actually don't have certainty about everything. That is not my position. I think that there are massive problems with fallibilism, so I would reject that. But I also don't think that certainty is required for all items of knowledge. So I think I can justifiably believe something which is true, but my justification for it might not be strong enough to guarantee the truth of it. And so if the justification doesn't guarantee its truth, I can't have certainty of it in the epistemic sense, right? There's also kind of this psychological idea of certainty where, like, psychologically, I'm certain I'm having this conversation with you right now. But if you really pressed me, like, could I be a brain in a vat? Could I be dreaming? Okay, so I don't have epistemic certainty of this because my justification for my belief that I'm having this conversation with you right now is not so strong that the truth of that belief is guaranteed by it. So I think I have a justified true belief, but it's not certain. However, what I would say is that you need a certain foundation. So I would say that when we get down to like the very base level, you can't have probability all the way down. And my reason for that is because beliefs are always probable relative to something else. So if this belief up here, right, that let's say that I see a blue book over there, right? It's made probable by something else, right?
Okay.
Like that I see it. So probability always has a probability maker. There's something that makes it probable, right? Something can't be probable if there's nothing making it probable.
Mm.
And so the problem is if you try to transfer that all the way down an epistemic chain, you get to the most foundational belief, the basic belief that's, at the end of the chain, and we say it's only probably true. I'm going to ask, well, probably true relative to what? If you appeal to something else, then this is no longer a basic foundational belief. There's something else. And
Right.
I'll ask about that belief. Is that only probably true? And if so, probable relative to what? And so, it's just going to keep going. So in order to end the chain, it seems like you're either just going to have to say, oh, yeah, it's not actually probably true, in which case it's either certain or it's just not justified. And so then neither was anything else in the whole chain. And so that's kind of the short version of my argument. Why I do think you have to have certainty at the foundations, but once you have it there, you can have probability after that. Does that make sense?
No, that makes sense. And so we'll kind of nail down on that because it might not make sense for everybody. So I think what you said is a great kind of primer to where we're going. So talk to us a little bit, because I think this is where you're going, a little bit about the difference between kind of internalism and externalism when it comes to what you were just referring to as kind of that foundation. So what are the differences that we need to think about when it comes to those two categories?
Okay, so in order to understand that, we might actually have to back up a little bit and talk just a little bit about different theories of the structure of justification. So when we're talking about the structure of justification, we're talking about kind of the proverbial shape that our beliefs take. Because, and this kind of just begins with what's known as the regress problem. We think like we have some beliefs and we hold them on the basis of other beliefs, right? Maybe I believe that I had cereal for breakfast this morning. And I believe that because I remember it, and
I had cereal for lunch.
Well, some of us have no class. No, I'm kidding. But the point is, we can trace these beliefs back and change, right? So I believe something happened in history. Why do I think it happened in history? Oh, well, because my history teacher taught that to me, and I believe that. I believe that because I just remember her teaching that to me in class, and so we kind of build. That's what's known as an epistemic chain. This one belief up here, it depends on another belief, which depends on another one, and so then the question is like, well, how did that original belief get justified, right? How far back does that go? And so kind of the three main ways of solving that issue have been maybe one's known as infinitism. It just says that chain goes on forever. You've got coherentism, which says, well, it just kind of goes in a circle. And then you've got foundationalism, which says it terminates in a belief that's justified, but it's not justified by another belief.
Okay.
And those are all internalist theories of justification. Internalism would be the belief that awareness is required for justification. So in order for something to justify any of my beliefs, I've got to be aware of it, right? Because let's say there's this great argument for God's existence out there, right? Maybe it completely proves God's existence, but I have no awareness of that. All right, let's say I have no awareness of this great argument that proves God's existence. It doesn't seem like I can believe in God on the basis of that argument that I have no awareness of, right?
Right.
So that's kind of the guiding principle for internalism. There's got to be some awareness there.
Right.
And so externalism is a theory that throws out that awareness requirement.
Okay.
So most of them are going to agree with the foundationalists, right? That we've got some beliefs that we're justified, or they might prefer the term warranted, but we're justified or warranted in holding these beliefs in the absence of other beliefs. But the internalist is going to say, but you've got to be aware of some reason that allows you to hold that foundational belief. The externalist says, no, you don't. You don't have to have any awareness for why that foundational basic belief is justified. It just has to be, let's say, reliably produced. So let's say you've got reliable cognitive faculties. You don't have to know that you have reliable cognitive faculties. Just as long as objectively from the third person you do, then the belief that they produce, it's warranted. You're allowed to hold it even without awareness. So I hope that's a sufficiently clear distinction between internalism and externalism.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really good. So maybe at this point, what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about, maybe we'll just use the existence of God, even though that's not something that we'll go into super elaborate detail, but maybe we'll just use it as our example as we kind of talk through some of these things, because it's a relevant question and a lot of us are thinking about it. So when we think about that foundation, most people would say that, if God exists, then we can have reliable faculties, and then they continue on their epistemological journey, right? So I know that that's not necessarily the position that you hold. So for you, you're saying that the kind of the internalist view of justification, while you do believe that God does exist, and you believe that, that reality, I'm assuming that reality is ontologically dependent on God, your ability to know is not dependent on God's existence. Am I describing that correctly?
From the epistemic perspective, yeah. So in an ontological sense, obviously, I wouldn't know anything had God not created me.
Right, exactly.
I wouldn't know anything if my mom hadn't, given birth to me.
Right.
So,
right.
yeah, I am a dependent. I'm a dependent being. But epistemically, the question could come up: can I know anything if I don't include a belief that God exists and has created me in such a way that my cognitive faculties are reliable? My position would be, yeah, I think I can know things without bringing that belief to the table, and then I can infer God's belief, or rather belief in God later on.
Okay. So I think this would be a good time to maybe lay out some of these broad categories of maybe groups of people that have investigated or that are in the process of investigating God's existence, and kind of how they do it, if you will. So what are the broad categories? And then we'll kind of start to narrow down a little bit more to your specific view. So I'm really hoping that in this episode, if you're watching this, that you're kind of thinking, okay, there's maybe more to this conversation than I originally thought, is what my goal would be for you here. And so go ahead and just kind of give us those broad categories of ways that people defend God, or give evidence for God's existence, if you will, and then we'll start to kind of narrow down and talk about each one a little bit more in detail.
Yeah, so this is a question of religious epistemology. So our religious beliefs like that God exists, that miracles are possible, that the Bible is true, beliefs like that. How is it that these beliefs are rational? How are they justified or warranted? What makes these beliefs different than just arbitrary hunches, beliefs that, were just kind of handed down to us? What is it that makes the difference there? That is a controversial topic.
It is.
So let's see. We've got probably broadly 4 different ways of approaching that. So one position would be an externalist position, and this would be something like Alvin Plantinga, if you know that name.
Yep.
He would probably be a good defender of this. It would be called proper functionalism. And the idea here is that, so there's a foundationalist view of knowledge. So you've got beliefs that come in kind of 2 sets. You've got the foundational beliefs, and then you've got the inferential beliefs. These inferential top-level beliefs, they all owe their justification to these basic beliefs.
Okay.
But Plantinga's an externalist. So he says you don't have to have any kind of awareness for why these beliefs are appropriately held. It's important, though, he's not saying that there aren't reasons for why your basic beliefs, your foundational beliefs, are appropriately held. He says there is a reason, but you don't have awareness of it. And so what he wants to say that reason is that your cognitive faculties function properly. And so when you've got properly functioning cognitive faculties, then any beliefs that you infer from those basic beliefs are, he prefers the term warranted. He doesn't like the term justification, so he wants to use the term warrant.
Right.
But he's talking about the same thing, a belief that you're allowed to hold, essentially.
Yeah.
And so he wants to say that God doesn't have to be one of those higher level beliefs, because maybe God has created us with what he wants to call a sensus divinitatis, which is a term he gets from John Calvin. But the idea here is that you've almost got this organ, right, or this cognitive faculty that is designed to detect God, just as your eyes are designed to see things, your ears are designed to hear things, your nose is designed to smell things, your skin is designed to feel things. Well, he says people can have a cognitive faculty that is designed to detect God. And so just as he doesn't think you need any further justification for believing what you see, as long as as long as your eyes are functioning properly, then whatever belief you get there, you're warranted in holding it without a further reason. And he says, I don't see why God can't be one of those beliefs. Why can't I just sense that God is real? To use his language, I just find myself believing in God, and it's warranted. I don't need an argument. I don't need evidence. I find myself having that belief, and as long as it's been produced by a reliable process, it is warranted just as much as any other foundational belief.
I would say that probably is what most Christians hold to. At least they wouldn't be able to articulate it nearly as well as you did. That was a fantastic articulation of planting as belief, a properly basic belief. But I would say from my experience, the Christians that I've talked to, they would, in their own way, essentially describe what you just described. I remember there was a Billy Graham Association training that was happening at a church that I was employed at, and I got a chance to kind of hang out with the instructor right before he kind of went on, and I was getting into apologetics. I was going through this deconstructing journey, so my mind was just filled with a bunch of questions, and this guy is here to train people to be evangelists and to answer questions for people. And so I was like, man, how do you know that God exists? It was kind of just one of those basic questions. I thought I would, maybe he'd give me the moral argument or whatever, but he essentially laid out what you just did. So I would say that category that I kind of talked about at the beginning of most Christians don't really know why they believe, they can't articulate the reasons that they believe, would articulate something along the lines of what you just said, where Plantinga talks about kind of a properly basic belief. So, okay, with that out of the way, what are the other categories?
Yeah, so some people don't really like that, though, because it doesn't sit well with them that you've got no awareness of it, right? So from your own first-person perspective, you have no more reason for thinking that God exists than you would for if the belief just popped into your head that aliens exist, that there's a teapot floating around Saturn. Your belief that God exists, you got no more reason for believing that than somebody does for believing those things. Now, there might be a difference if you really have this sensus divinitatis, if it's really functioning properly,
right,
then maybe the belief is warranted. But again, from your perspective, no subjective assurance whatsoever that belief is actually true.
Mm-hmm.
And so some people would like to say that's not really blessed assurance. And so if you're interested in having a little subjective assurance, then that's going to put you to more of an internalist position. Now, on the internalist position, you've got some variety there. You've got what's known as phenomenal conservatism.
Okay.
Phenomenal conservatism, it's foundationalist. So it says you've got those two tiers of beliefs. You've got the basic beliefs, the foundational beliefs, and then the inferential beliefs. But they want to say belief in God can still be properly basic. So they want to say that's still one of those beliefs that you can hold without any other beliefs. But they don't want to go where Plantinga does. They don't want to say that there's no difference from your own perspective between you believing in God and somebody believing that there's a teapot, orbiting Saturn. So their criteria for basic beliefs is what they want to call a seeming. So if something seems to you to be the case, then you've got justification in the absence of a defeater, which is a reason for giving up a belief. In the absence of that, then if something seems to be the case to you, you have justification for believing it. So where they're going to differ from Plantinga is whereas in Plantinga, there is just no reason that you're aware of. You just have the belief that God exists and it's warranted. They would say it seems to them that God exists. And so they're not appealing to another belief. They're just appealing to the way something seems to them. And then that gives them some level of justification for believing that God exists, and it can be a properly basic belief. Personally, I think that's a much better way to go than Plantinga, because at least there's some kind of subjective difference there.
Right.
But that would be the phenomenal conservativist, or I don't know if that's the correct way to say it, but that would be their position. Another internalist position, and the one that I would take, is classical foundationalism.
Okay.
It's an unpopular view these days. But classical foundationalism, again, foundationalist, obviously, so you've got the two tiers of beliefs. But we're going to say that these bottom-level basic foundational beliefs, we need strong justification for them, because everything else stands or falls on those beliefs. And so basically, they've got to be true. And so I would say that the truth of those beliefs is basically it's got to be guaranteed. So I don't think that you can have a belief that, it can't just seem to you to be the case. You can't just hope that it was formed by a reliable process. You've got to know that this belief is true. And so there's a few different ways that people cash out what the justification for those beliefs look like. My own view is going to be known as a direct acquaintance. So acquaintance is going to be a type of awareness that is basically where the mind meets reality. So it's where it's kind of this direct connection that happens between the mind, consciousness, and some fact about reality. An example I like to give is a headache, right? If you have a headache, you know it, right? And you're not looking to some other belief, right? It's not like I had to infer the belief that I had a headache from something else.
Right.
There's just kind of this immediacy to it. And that's kind of the idea what I'm talking about when I talk about a direct acquaintance. I think we can extend that to other experiences. We can extend that to the content of our memories. We've got just kind of this direct connection to it. We're not inferring it from an argument. We're not making an inductive inference, nothing like that. We've just got this connection to it. And I would actually say that there are three acquaintances that come into play. So parodying, remember I talked about the correspondence theory of truth before, right?
Right.
There's a fact, you've got a belief, and that belief matches the fact, so you've got correspondence. So there's three elements there. Well, I parody those three elements with three acquaintances. So I think I've got direct acquaintance with a fact, right? Like the fact that I have a headache, fact that I'm in pain, now the belief, I've got a direct acquaintance with the belief that I'm in pain, and then I've got acquaintance with the fact that this fact corresponds to that belief. Okay. And that means that the truth is guaranteed, right? Because that's everything. That's everything that there is to something being true. And so when you have those three acquaintances, there's just no way for your belief to be false. And so I would say that is a sufficient account of how you can have non-inferential justification for a foundational belief. The problem is, and the reason it's not popular, is that God doesn't seem to fit that category. God doesn't seem to be the sort of thing where I can be acquainted with the fact that he exists. Okay. Because pretty much anything I'm acquainted with could be explained, right, by me being in the Matrix or me being a brain in a vat, something like that. And so to get knowledge of a physical external world, I got to make an inference, right? I got to say, well, that's the best explanation of these experiences. But that automatically seems to cut God out of being a properly basic belief. And so that's one reason my position is not popular. Now, I want to be clear. I think you can still get to God. It's just you have to get there by means of arguments and evidence.
Right. Okay. So that's a really good point, because that was going to be my question is I can hear the person watching this being like, oh, so you're just going to say that you have a direct acquaintance with God and really you didn't help anybody out. You just kind of made this claim that just like a headache, you have a direct acquaintance with God. So I'm glad that there are some other steps to your process of kind of concluding that God exists. So that's kind of like the internalist view of Plantinga's view. But are there any other categories out there that people use?
I'll add one other one. So this other one called presuppositionalism.
Okay.
Presuppositionalists, they're weird because I can't tell if they're internalists or if they're externalists. They really seem to put whichever shoe on is convenient at the time. I'm sorry, I couldn't help it. Presuppositionalism is basically the idea that unless you are presupposing God, and not just any God, unless you're presupposing the triune God that the Bible reveals to us, you literally don't know anything at all. You can't have justification for any of your beliefs if you are not going to start with that assumption. And so that's kind of the baseline of presuppositionalism, is that without assuming the God of Christianity, you don't have justification for any of your beliefs. To kind of bolster that, they'll bring up a lot of traditional problems in philosophy, and I'll try not to get too detailed, but basically David Hume advanced an argument against the inductive reasoning. He argued that any appeals to induction are inherently circular, and so they will use that and say, well, see, if you're not presupposing that the Christian God exists who upholds nature, then you don't have any justification for believing that the future will be like the past. You can't do science, so, atheists, you can kiss science goodbye. They'll go further than that. They'll be like, if you don't believe that Christian God exists, then you don't have any justification for believing in laws of logic, right? And how do you justify laws of logic without going in a circle, right? Because all arguments depend on logic. So it seems like you kind of can't give an argument for logic. They'll argue that you can't even trust basic sense perception, right? Because how do you know that it's reliable unless you're assuming that God created you in just this, in a proper way? So that's the essence of presuppositionalism. I think it's fair to say that's probably the least popular of the three, at least among academics, but that's another position that's out there.
Yeah, and I mean, so I would say we can kind of get into kind of our personal viewpoints on some things because, I'm open-minded. Maybe you'll convince me. It's one of the reasons that I loved your channel and started working through a bunch of your videos. But I guess I would categorize myself as ontologically presuppositionalist, but in action, but epistemologically, I'm an evidentialist in that sense. And so I do think that, and maybe you would say that as well, but I think that we can use arguments and evidence, but that those wouldn't make any sense apart from the existence of God. So it's where a presuppositionalist would argue from those presuppositions to their interlocutor. I would start with evidence and continue to point out, physical evidences, and I would point out, scientific evidences as support in an argument for God's existence, or, point out evidences like the, I'm blanking on Lydia McGrew's, like the undesigned coincidences as the historical reliability of the New Testament. I would start with those types of evidences, and when I see most presuppositionalists argue, they start from like the things like, the problem of the one and the many, and the consistency of logic and stuff like that. So my methodology is very different. So how would you respond to somebody like me? Am I just completely out to lunch, or am I on the right track as far as you're concerned?
Well, so I mean, I would agree with the methodology that you are taking. I don't know if I would say that you are even ontologically a presuppositionalist, though, because I mean, everyone agrees. Every Christian is going to agree that ontologically, we can't think if God didn't create us, for the simple reason that we wouldn't exist if God didn't create us.
Right.
But the presuppositionalist is going to vehemently, push back on me. He said, that is not what I'm saying. I'm saying unless you consciously include God in your thinking, then you actually don't have justification for any belief whatsoever. And so he's going to want to argue that depending on the particular presuppositionalist, he would argue that you're either making a mistake by you're granting the atheist or skeptic all of these tools that he can't justify in the first place, right? Because if you're giving evidence to someone, they're going to say, well, you're already granting them logic and induction, and you shouldn't be doing that. More extreme ones would actually say that you're sinning in doing that. So, then again, it's a variety. There are different types of presuppositionalists, but I don't agree with that. I think that we do have justification for logical laws and for induction that don't have to make reference to God. And in fact, I'm just not sure how saying I'm going to presuppose God really solves the problem. It's just like saying I'm assuming that this solves the problem, but I'm not actually going to demonstrate the reality of it. So it seems like it just kind of includes this extra step that we don't ever actually get to discharge. So we don't actually get to see that induction really is justified. We're just going to assume that it is because we're assuming that God makes nature. I hope that makes sense.
No, that does make sense. So again, let's kind of piggyback on some of that and talk a little bit about all of our friends and their friends. We love them. All of our friends that will say something along the lines of, we need science in order to be able to know anything about reality at all. Again, I can use some very specific examples of this. So one of them would be, there's a YouTuber, I'm sure you're familiar with, some of the audience might be familiar with him, called Pine Creek Doug. And Pine Creek Doug was having a conversation with, I think, the Tim and Lydia McGrew, who, again, you're very familiar with, and Jonathan McClatchy, you've been on Jonathan McClatchy's show. Jonathan McClatchy has been on my show. He's a good friend of mine. But Pine Creek Doug was talking to them. Basically, Pine Creek Doug was trying to set up an analogy saying, oh, I had this invisible, it wasn't imaginary, I had this invisible fire-breathing dragon when I was a kid, and I wrote down all of these journal entries about my experiences with the dragon. My uncle, who has since passed away, wrote down some things because he saw him as well, and so now all we have are these kind of older documents. How would you go about verifying or proving that I was right or wrong about my invisible fire-breathing dragon? And what Pine Creek Doug was trying to do is trying to create an analogy to the New Testament, essentially pushing back on the McGrews and Jonathan McClatchy, saying this is just as silly, essentially. If you don't have any way to verify that the invisible fire-breathing dragon exists, then to hold that belief is silly. And so he was creating that cross point with God's existence, saying we don't have any way to verify the belief that God actually exists or the actual ontological claim that God exists. We have no more ability to do that than we do my invisible fire-breathing dragon. So from your standpoint, what do we do with people that maybe fall into that camp? How would you address some of their epistemology?
Well, yeah, that particular example is I was just thinking how completely disanalogous an invisible dragon is to the Gospels. But yeah, people who hold kind of to a very scientific view that kind of the only way we achieve knowledge is by means of science. I think it's important to emphasize to these people that we're not opposed to science. So, we agree. Yeah, we can make great advances. We can learn a lot through the scientific method. In fact, I would say it's as far as making inferences are concerned, I think that scientific inferences are probably some of the best, just because there's a repeatability there that we don't have with other types of inferences. But I think there's a problem if you want to say that's the only way that a person is going to be able to gain knowledge. Mostly because, first of all, strict scientism, if you're really going to say, I know that science is the only way to gain knowledge, I'm going to kind of want to know how you know that. Because if you can't know that through science, then it seems like you're caught in a self-refutation. If you do know it through science, it seems like it's circular. So there's plausibly a self-refutation there, or there's a problem in that. Right. And then this is where I think it actually is useful to kind of use the sort of arguments that presuppositionalists use, not the same way that they would, but bring up something like, what about the problem of induction, right? What if how do you justify your belief that the future is going to be like the past? You can't do that through science because science assumes that. Now, again, I don't think that the presuppositionalist has the correct solution to that problem. I think we can solve that problem, but we have to do it through philosophy. And so if we're admitting that philosophy gives us knowledge, then we're not saying that science is the only way that gets us knowledge. So, it depends, because you have to do it on a case-by-case basis. But basically, those are some strategies I would take if somebody's saying you can only get knowledge through the scientific method.
Yeah, okay, so I have one more question that I want to throw at you, but I do want to emphasize something that I've kind of said before on my channel, and maybe you can give it a little bit of legs before I ask this last question. And really, one of the things that I hold to in this whole epistemology thing is we have to look at the nature of the claim in order to be able to understand what sort of methodology we might use in order to be able to investigate that. So in the example that I was giving with Pine Creek Doug, you would look at, well, if this is a historical claim, you're not asking for something that's repeatable in the same way, because you have to admit that there can be one-time events that happened in history that aren't repeatable. Like you can't repeat the Civil War in that sense. You can't repeat, Caesar crossing the Rubicon or whatever. You can't repeat those types of things. So you have to look at different sort of evidence. You're looking at textual evidence or archaeological evidence, and again, you're making some inference. If we're talking about the existence of a star, or like you mentioned earlier, like a teacup going around Saturn, right? That's a physical claim. I don't know how to define a fire-breathing dragon apart from material. I don't know how to do that. So the claim in and of itself seems mismatched to what you're asking it to do. And so again, when we're talking about metaphysical claims like the existence of God, we would use a different methodology than we would for physical claims about physical reality. Would you agree, or would you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I say sometimes it's sad that we have to point these sorts of things out, but yes, there's a reason that there are different fields of study, and that's because there are different types of propositions. And so, yes, a historical proposition is going to be assessed differently than a scientific proposition, and a scientific proposition is going to be assessed differently than some sort of like analytic philosophical proposition. So we've got different methods and different fields of study precisely because there are different types of reality. And so there's different ways that we're going to come to know those. An analogy that's kind of often given is you shouldn't look for something that's plastic with a metal detector, right? You're using the wrong tool for the job. And so I think that was the point that you're basically making, is that, yeah, we're going to investigate different claims in different ways, because we're going to expect different kinds of evidence. If it exists at all, we're going to find it in different places.
Yeah, and like you said, you mentioned earlier about justification, that the types of justification we're going to use are going to be kind of parallel with the claims that we're making. And so if we're using a scientific justification, that's because we're looking for a material, repeatable, testable, repeatable, verifiable type claim. So I want you to help me set up kind of my next video in this series, where I look at kind of the arguments or the path I would take in order to demonstrate that God exists, in order to provide evidence that God exists. And one of the major pushbacks that I get, and I think this is an epistemological issue, and that's why I want your insight on it, is some people will say, and someone just said this to me yesterday on Facebook, that something like the Kalam cosmological argument, and the first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And they would say, well, what you're doing is, if you're using observational type evidence, if you're looking for that you're looking for evidence for that type of premise to support that premise, you can't then go outside of the universe, because we have no way to verify whether or not the claim everything that begins to exist has a cause is true, or even likely to be true, outside of the universe or beyond the universe. And so if you're talking about the claim in the second premise, which is that the universe began to exist, you can't do that. So how would you respond to something along those lines, that we have no way to verify cause and effect, let's say, just as an example, outside of our universe, so therefore the first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument can only be true with inside our universe, because we have the ability to verify it here?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I've always thought that the stronger support for that premise comes from philosophical arguments for the impossibility of traversing actual infinities. So, first of all, you could just point out that our only argument, or our only justification for accepting that premise, doesn't come from empirical evidence. In fact, the stronger evidence points against that. But I mean, you can really, that level of skepticism, where people are like, well, we don't know what goes on outside of our own universe. Well, I mean, yeah, but in fact, we don't even know everything that goes on inside of our own universe. But I just posted a good quote on Facebook just a little bit before I came on here, which is about how our justification for our beliefs depends on the information that we have available to us. We can't make inferences based on information that isn't available to us. It doesn't make sense. If you don't have it available to you, then you can't take it into account. And so, yeah, of course, we're going to go based on the evidence that we have in the universe that's available to us. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the evidence that we have at our disposal. It would also be worth pointing out, perhaps, that we don't have evidence that things begin to exist without a cause outside of our own universe. But also, you can also point out, we are talking about the origin of our universe. So, these are just kind of these sorts of objections, I think, are very selectively skeptical. So people don't apply this level of skepticism unless it's being used to support something that to support an objection to an argument that has a conclusion that is unfavorable to them. So I always say people can dial the skepticism as high as they want, but but make them be consistent. And so, if you're going to say, okay, well, I'm not going to, make beliefs based on evidence in the universe that I'm a part of, because there might be other things that are happening outside of the universe. Well, okay, but then, don't hold any beliefs about, things that are based on regularities in this universe.
Right.
Be consistent with yourself.
No, David, thank you so much for being on the show. David's channel is called Faith Because of Reason. It is excellent. You should subscribe to it. You should watch all of his videos. And even if some of them feel like they're over your head, watch them again and again and again, as I do. That's probably why you have so many views on your channels, because I think I've watched several of your videos multiple times and I've taken notes. So privileged to have you on the show and discuss some of this nerd truth epistemology thing. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I hope that conversation with David gave you some insight into this whole notion of truth. Again, we did not cover everything. We only had an hour to discuss some of these things. But what I really wanted to do in this conversation was just to make you aware of some of the philosophical categories that are out there, because we are going to use them as we continue to investigate the truth of Christianity, as we pull apart different pieces and deconstruct each one of them and see if it's something that's necessary, something that's true to the reality, to what's going on in reality, or if it's something that we can dispose of. So thank you so much for checking out this video. I would invite you to join our Facebook group. The link for that is in the description. And if this is something that you are on this deconstructing journey and you are trying to figure out some of this stuff, would invite you to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell. And I hope to see you next time as we continue to deal with deconstruction.